7 experienced hikers entered the Siberian mountains. Within minutes, they began collapsing, bleeding, screaming, convulsing. Only one would survive. This is the story of the Khamar-Daban incident, a tragedy far less known than Dyatlov Pass, but every bit as terrifying. In August of 1993, a small trekking group set out into one of Russia's most unforgiving mountain ranges, the Khamar-Daban, near the colossal Lake Baikal. For this group of 7, it was supposed to be a routine expedition, a Category 4 trek challenging, but manageable for their skill level. The team was led by Lyudmila Korovina, a 41-year-old instructor with a formidable reputation. She was a master of survival sports, a seasoned veteran of the wilderness who had trained countless others. Her students looked up to her, trusted her implicitly. Victoria Zalesova, Timur Babanov, and 17-year-old Valentina Yutoshenko. All were physically fit, trained, and prepared for the rigors of the Siberian wild. The expedition began smoothly. The weather was stable. The spirits were high. They made their way through the lush, dense taiga, following the winding Unsolved and Snezhnaya rivers. Their goal was the Relentless Peak, a journey that would test their endurance, but reward them with breathtaking views. For the first few days, everything went according to plan. But in Siberia, the weather is a fickle and brutal master. On August 5th, their world began to unravel. A powerful storm system, a cyclone, swept in with breathtaking speed. The clear skies vanished, replaced by a churning, oppressive gray. A relentless, freezing rain began to fall, mixed with sleet. The temperature plummeted. The group was caught on an exposed, treeless slope near the summit of Relentless at an altitude of over 2,300 meters. There was no natural shelter, nowhere to hide from the storm's fury. Lyudmila Korovina made a critical decision. They would make an emergency camp right there on the open ridge. It was a desperate move. They were completely exposed, but descending in the blinding storm was arguably even more dangerous. They huddled together, trying to set up a tent against the gale-force winds, their bodies already numb from the biting cold. The conditions were brutal, but not entirely unprecedented for experienced Siberian hikers. They knew the risks. What they didn't know was that this storm was just the prelude to a far greater horror. As they struggled against the elements, something went wrong. Horribly wrong. It started with Alexander Krisin. Suddenly, he began to act erratically. He started screaming, clawing at his throat. According to the sole survivor's account, his eyes started bleeding and foam frothed at his mouth. He collapsed to the ground, convulsing violently. Panic erupted. Before anyone could process what was happening to Krisin, Denis Shvakin fell, then Tatiana Filtova. One by one, members of the group began to exhibit the same terrifying symptoms. They screamed, they thrashed, they seemed to be in unimaginable agony. Some reports mentioned them tearing at their own clothes, fighting an invisible enemy. It was a cascade of madness and death. Lyudmila Korovina, the experienced leader, desperately tried to regain control. She shouted orders, trying to rally the few who were still standing, trying to understand the nightmare unfolding around her. But then she too succumbed. The rock of the group, the master of survival, suddenly clutched her chest and collapsed, suffering an apparent heart attack. The last pillar of hope was gone. In a matter of minutes, the group was decimated. 6 of the 7 hikers lay dead or dying on the cold, wet ground. Surrounded by the bodies of her friends and her mentor, she was consumed by a primal terror she had never known. She saw her friends bleeding from their eyes and ears, dying in convulsions. She described it as a sudden, inexplicable madness. She didn't know what was happening. Was it a poison? A gas? An attack? All she knew was that she had to run. Fueled by adrenaline and sheer terror, Valentina fled. She grabbed a single plastic sheet for cover and scrambled down the mountainside. Away from the scene of horror, not daring to look back. For days, Valentina survived alone in the wilderness. She was injured, terrified, and grieving, but she kept moving. She sheltered under rocks, foraged for what little food she could find, and followed a power line she stumbled upon, hoping it would lead to civilization. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity, she staggered to a river and was spotted by a group of tourists on a catamaran. They rescued her, pulling her from the edge of oblivion. Her harrowing testimony was the first and only first-hand account of the tragedy on Khamar-Daban. It was her words describing the bleeding, the convulsions, the sudden madness that ignited the mystery. Once the alarm was raised, a massive search and rescue operation was launched. They were located scattered across the exposed ridge, just as Valentina had described. The official investigation began, and the autopsies were performed. The conclusion was shockingly mundane: hypothermia. The official cause of death for most of the hikers was listed as freezing to death. Ludmila Korovina's death was attributed to a heart attack. The reports found no evidence of poisoning, no signs of a violent struggle with an outside party. Some medical examiners noted signs consistent with protein deficiency and extreme cold stress, which could lead to pulmonary edema fluid in the lungs, explaining some of the frothing at the mouth. But this official explanation felt hollow. It failed to satisfy those who heard Valentina's story. How could simple hypothermia cause a group of experienced hikers to drop dead within minutes of each other? Why the bleeding from the eyes and ears? Why the violent convulsions and shared madness? The official cause of death just didn't seem to fit the horrific details of the survivor's account. And so, the theories began to emerge. The most scientific theory points to severe fulminant hypothermia. In extreme cold, the body can react in strange ways. It can cause disorientation, hallucinations, and aggression. It can also lead to a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, where victims feel intensely hot just before death and start tearing off their clothes. Could this explain the chaos? Perhaps, but it doesn't fully account for the speed of their deaths or the bleeding. Other theories venture into more speculative territory. Some suggest the group was exposed to a toxic gas released from a fault line in the earth, or perhaps from decaying nerve agents left over from military activities. The remote Siberian wilderness has long been a dumping ground and testing site for the military. Could they have stumbled into an invisible cloud of poison? Another idea is food contamination. Perhaps they ingested a potent natural toxin, like a poisonous plant or fungus, mistaken for something edible. But an experienced leader like Korovina would likely have been vigilant about that. Then there are the more fringe theories. Some have proposed infrasound low-frequency sound waves generated by wind patterns over the terrain, which can cause feelings of anxiety, nausea, and dread. Others point to an avalanche shockwave or a lightning strike, events that could cause severe internal injuries without leaving obvious external marks. Inevitably, the Khamar-Daban incident draws comparisons to Russia's most famous mountain mystery, the Dyatlov Pass incident. Both involved a group of experienced hikers dying under bizarre circumstances in a remote, snowy mountain range. Both include reports of strange behavior and baffling injuries. And both are fueled by incomplete documentation and the inherent difficulty of investigating anything in such a harsh, isolated environment. But while Dyatlov Pass has become a global phenomenon, Khamar-Daban remains its shadowy, lesser-known cousin, a chilling footnote in the annals of unexplained deaths. The investigation was far less public, and the records are even harder to come by. We must also consider the psychological factors. The extreme stress of the storm, the intense cold, and the sudden collapse of one member could have triggered a chain reaction of panic and hysteria. And we cannot discount the impact of trauma on memory. Valentina Yudoshenko endured an unimaginable ordeal. It's possible that the sheer horror of the event warped her perception, blending the grim reality of death by exposure with the nightmarish imagery of her own fear. Yet, Even with these explanations, a core of unease remains. The speed, the synchronicity, the screams. Valentina's account paints a picture not of a slow, creeping death from cold, but of a sudden, violent, and inexplicable force that tore her group apart in minutes. 7 hikers climbed into the Siberian wilderness, full of life and ambition. Within hours, on an exposed, storm-lashed ridge, 6 of them were dead. The official report says the mountains simply took them, that the cold was a killer more than capable. But exposure alone does not explain the screams. It doesn't explain the bleeding eyes. In the silent, unforgiving mountains of Siberia, something went terribly, terribly wrong. And only one person lived to remember the horror. The truth, whatever it may be, was left behind on that mountain, buried under the snow and the silence. Thanks for watching. If you found this story unsettling, please consider liking and subscribing for more explorations into the unknown. Stay safe out there,